Welcome to Rise Untold, where the stories behind the spotlight come alive. For decades, one name has echoed whenever people speak of the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. His charm, his voice, his stage presence, they made him a global icon. To millions, he wasn't just a singer, he was a phenomenon. But what if I told you that the crown sitting on Elvis's head might not have been his to wear at all? What if the true king of rock and roll was someone else? Someone who built the very foundation Elvis stood on. That someone was Chuck Berry. To understand why, we have to look at the birth of rock and roll itself. Elvis may have perfected the performance, but Chuck Berry invented the language. Before Elvis, before the Beatles, before the Rolling Stones, there was Chuck Berry writing riffs that would shape music forever. His guitar wasn't just an instrument, it was a revolution. Without Berry, there would be no Johnny B. Goode, no iconic riffs for the Stones to copy, no Electric Blueprint for Hendrix, and yes, no Beatles. Elvis was magnetic. He could walk on stage, curl his lip, and make crowds scream. But here's the truth. Elvis was standing on a stage that Berry had already built. Elvis himself admitted it. Tom Jones once recalled watching Chuck Berry with Elvis, and Elvis turned to him and said, "There's the real king of rock and roll up there right now." Imagine that. The man crowned as king, pointing to Berry and calling him the true ruler. But history didn't play fair. Elvis, with his smooth voice and unmatched charisma, became the face the world wanted to see. He had mainstream appeal in a time when segregation still divided America. While Chuck Berry was writing the music, Elvis was delivering it to audiences who might never have listened otherwise. Berry became the father of rock and roll in the headlines. But a father isn't a king. That title kept slipping away from him, denied again and again. Chuck Berry didn't just create music. He created a cultural framework. He gave teenagers an identity at a time when teenagers as a concept barely existed. He gave them songs about love, rebellion, cars, and dancing. He spoke to a generation that wanted freedom and found it in his guitar strings. He mirrored their frustrations and dreams, turning sound into a symbol of resistance. Elvis sang rock and roll. Berry lived it. Think about this. If Berry hadn't redefined how music was written and performed, if he hadn't given the youth a soundtrack for their rebellion, what would Elvis have sung about? There wouldn't have been anything to be good at if Chuck Berry hadn't first created the rules of the game. Elvis was extraordinary, yes, but he was playing on Berry's field. Critics often call Berry the father of rock and roll, but that feels like an understatement. He wasn't just a parent figure nurturing a genre. He was the architect. He was the empire builder. Elvis may have been the star on the throne, but the throne itself, that was Berry's creation. Berry altered the trajectory of music as we know it. Without him, there are no Beatles, no Stones, no Hendrix, no guitar riffs, no rebellious sound that carried through decades. His genius was in taking rhythm and blues and turning it into something explosive, something that could not be ignored. His lyrics spoke of real life, of youth wanting to break free. And in every note, he gave them permission to be loud, to be themselves, to be revolutionary. Elvis Presley deserves recognition. He was a phenomenal performer, and his impact on pop culture is undeniable. But to call him the king of rock and roll is to erase the man who gave birth to the genre. Elvis carried the crown in public, but Chuck Berry forged it in fire. And maybe, after all these years, it's time to set the record straight. Elvis was the prince. Chuck Berry was the king. So when you hear people call Elvis the king of rock and roll, pause for a second. Think about the riffs that still shape the music we listen to today. Think about the courage it took to write songs that gave a generation its voice. Think about how history often crowns the performer, but forgets the creator. And ask yourself, doesn't Chuck Berry deserve the throne? Because legends don't always get the titles they deserve. Sometimes history writes its own version of royalty, but if you strip away the glamour, the fame, and the spotlight and look only at the roots, one truth remains unshakable. Elvis Presley sang rock and roll. Chuck Berry invented it. Think about what that really means. Elvis took a sound that was already crafted and brought it to the masses. He was the shining face, the poster boy of rebellion, the man who shook his hips and drove America wild, but that fire he carried, it wasn't born inside Graceland. It had already been lit years before by a man who bent guitar strings until they screamed with electricity, by a man who didn't just perform music, he created a whole new language with it. That man was Chuck Berry. Elvis grew into a superstar. His voice was smooth, his look was magnetic, his presence was electrifying. He had that rare combination of talent and charisma that could turn an entire crowd into believers with just one song. But let's not confuse charisma with creation. Elvis was a vessel that carried the music forward, yes, but Chuck Berry was the wellspring. Without Berry, there would be no Elvis the way we know him, and even Elvis himself knew it. Tom Jones once recalled watching Chuck Berry perform live alongside Elvis Presley. He remembered Elvis leaning over and saying, "There's the real king of rock and roll up there right now." Imagine that, the man the world had crowned king, openly pointing to Berry and acknowledging who truly wore the crown. It was a rare moment of honesty, a moment that cuts through decades of carefully built myth. But why didn't history crown Berry the king? Why does his name often come second, remembered as the father of the genre instead of its ruler? The answer is complex, wrapped up in race, culture, and timing. In the 1950s, America was deeply segregated. A black man could create a sound that moved the soul, but it was often a white performer who would be allowed to carry that sound into mainstream households. Chuck Berry was a pioneer, but Elvis Presley was the acceptable face of revolution. Berry's genius was more than just guitar riffs. He gave teenagers an identity. At a time when the concept of teenagers was barely understood, Berry wrote songs that spoke directly to their experiences. He wrote about cars, freedom, dancing, and love. The universal language of youth. He gave them an anthem to rebel with, a soundtrack for their restless energy. That's not just music, that's cultural engineering. It's no exaggeration to say that Berry altered the course of music forever. Without his riffs, there would be no Rolling Stones. Without his storytelling, there would be no Beatles. Without his fearless innovation, there would be no Hendrix. Every great rock band of the 20th century was, in some way, standing on the shoulders of Chuck Berry, and yet history handed the crown to Elvis. This isn't to say Elvis wasn't extraordinary. He absolutely was. He brought an energy that no one else could replicate. His voice could be tender one moment and explosive the next. His charisma was unmatched. He wasn't just a performer, he was a cultural force. He didn't just play rock and roll, he embodied it. But does embodying something mean you invented it? Does being the loudest name mean you are the truest one? Berry didn't just sing songs, he wrote them. He crafted them carefully, fusing rhythm and blues into a new sound that had never been heard before. He was a poet of rebellion, a storyteller, of youth. Songs like Johnny Be Good weren't just hits, they were blueprints. They taught an entire generation how to dream bigger, how to escape the boxes they were put in, how to believe in a world that was louder, freer, and faster than the one they inherited. Elvis sang those dreams, Berry created them, and yet history crowned Elvis. Why? Because America in the 1950s wasn't ready to put a black man on the throne. Berry was celebrated, yes, but always with caveats. They called him the father of rock. And roll, a nice title, but one that kept him in the shadows. A father builds, but a king rules. Elvis was allowed to be king. Berry was only ever allowed to be father. But titles don't change truth. Titles don't change history. If you look at the roots of rock and roll, if you strip away the glamour and the headlines, there is no denying where the genre came from. Berry's fingerprints are everywhere. He didn't just perform music, he rewrote the cultural DNA of an entire generation. Without Berry, there is no revolution. Without Berry, there is no crown to pass down. Elvis may have worn it, but Berry forged it. What's fascinating is how Berry's music reshaped the very concept of youth. Before him, music was largely for adults. Songs were safe, predictable, polite. Berry shattered that mold. He gave young people a mirror. He gave them permission to be reckless, to dance, to love loudly, to rebel. He gave them a sense of identity at a time when society expected them to remain silent, In doing so, he didn't just invent rock and roll, he invented the teenager. Elvis built his empire on that invention. He took the energy Barry unleashed and packaged it for the mainstream. He gave it a face America could accept. That doesn't diminish his brilliance, but it does reveal the imbalance in how history rewards one man while overlooking the other. Even today, decades later, the debate continues. Some argue Elvis was the king because he made rock and roll global. Others argue Barry was the king because he made it exist in the first place. But maybe the real question isn't who wore the crown. Maybe the real question is why some crowns are denied to those who deserve them most, because legends don't always get the titles they deserve. Sometimes history writes its own version of royalty. But when you dig deeper, when you peel back the layers of myth and marketing, the truth stands clear. Elvis Presley sang rock and roll. Chuck Berry invented it. And that difference matters. It matters because it reminds us that greatness isn't always recognized. It matters because it shows us how culture often crowns the visible star, but forgets the unseen architect. And it matters because it challenges us to question the stories we've been told. So maybe it's time to set the record straight. Elvis Presley was remarkable. He was a prince who brought the music to the world. But Chuck Berry? He was the king. The true king of rock and roll. And if Barry could rise from obscurity, change, culture forever inspire generations, and still be denied the crown, then maybe you too can rise in your own way. Maybe titles don't define you. Maybe recognition doesn't measure greatness. Maybe the real measure is in what you build, what you give, and how you change the world. Because in the end, crowns can be stolen, titles can be misplaced, but actions live forever. And that's why Chuck Berry's reign will never fade.